Hello and welcome to the Nourishing Bits podcast, Life Recipes for Empowered Living. I am your host and empowerment coach, Nicole Seals, and today is episode 53. Now, for those of you listening to the podcast audio, know that there is also a video version to this, and those videos can be located over at YouTube at the Nourishing Bits podcast. And we're going to be talking about a sensitive topic today. For those of you who are first-time listeners to the podcast at all, my background is in social work, and I've been in the field of mental health for over 20 years now. And what I like to do here at the show, and also just in my private practice, is really stress the importance of how information can change our lives. And so whenever we're experiencing conflict or crises or a challenge in our lives, one of the first things that we can do to help equip ourselves and to get the confidence that we need is to educate ourselves and get as informed as we can about what our options are and what the challenge is, what we're actually up against. So I spend a lot of time here on the show talking about certain challenges in life that come up and things that we're all having to deal with in our lives, whether it's stress and anxiety or healthcare or work and career, family. We talk a lot about family here. We also talk about the things that afflict families. So we talk about addiction, we talk about divorce, we talk about toxicity in the family relationships and dysfunction. So we really want to make sure that we're getting information that is going to help us and is going to serve us in order to reach our goals, which could be healing, overcoming pain, improving your life, getting closer relationships. And really excited that you're here to join me today. I hope that you find some benefit to this information and you continue to check back in on the podcast and that you also head over to nourishminds.com, which is really where all the action takes place. And I have books and self-help guides and videos there for you that can help you through your challenge or your journey. So be sure to check it out. Today's topic, like I was saying before, is a sensitive topic, and we tend to talk about sensitive topics here at Nourishing Bits. And it's about child abuse. It's about child abuse and neglect. And what I really wanted to do was to help people identify the signs of child abuse and neglect. This is helpful for anyone. If you are a parent yourself and you're listening to this information, it's helpful for you because you may find yourself in a relationship where you're concerned your partner or your spouse may be engaging in abusive behaviors. You yourself may have crossed a line and maybe you're experiencing some overwhelming emotions yourself. Maybe you're struggling with anxiety. Maybe you're struggling with addiction. Maybe you're going through your own trauma and it's really influenced your parenting. And it's caused you to do things and act in a certain way that you really don't in your core and in your heart. It's not who you are. But sometimes we tend to take the emotions that we can't really handle ourselves and we express it in a way and we project that onto other people. And if you're a parent, that quite often happens to your kids. So we want to talk a little bit about that today. We also want to talk about if you are just a family member or a friend or you're in a community or in a neighborhood and you have particular concerns about a child and you've had these concerns for a while, maybe you actually have had conversations with the child to where you think that there has been some type of neglect or abuse that's happened, but you're just not quite sure what to do and you have a lot of uncertainty about taking the next step. So I just want to help you with that. I want to give you some support in being able to make that decision. And the information that I'm going to share with you today are just the basics, the very basics about what you need to know and then what type of action you can take. So in order not to overwhelm you with too much information, I'm going to break it down into 3 different sections. So the first section, we're really going to be talking about the importance of knowing the signs. So there's a reason why it is that we need to educate ourselves about the signs of child abuse and neglect. And we're going to talk about that. And then we're also going to talk about the different types of abuse. And then I'm going to give you some signs and indicators that you can look for. The second thing that we're going to talk about is how to report child abuse. Once you've determined that your suspicions, you've got some pretty clear suspicions and you feel very strong and confident about making your next step, we're going to talk about that process of reporting. More importantly, we're going to talk about all the emotional barriers that are going to come up for you before making that call, which are very common. It can be an overwhelming experience and intimidating. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. And then the third section, we're going to wrap this up by talking about when you're a parent and your behaviors have crossed the line and become abusive. And this is really about helping you to gain some awareness into that. And like I said before, if you're a parent and you suspect your partner is engaging in some abusive behavior, this will help you to really get a clear understanding of what you're dealing with and maybe that next step that you need to take. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into the first section. The first section is really about understanding what child abuse is and then being able to spot the signs so that you can then decide what type of action that you need to take. We're going to break them down into 4 categories because child abuse is typically defined into 4 different types. The first is general neglect, and I start with general neglect because it is the most commonly reported form of child abuse. Most of the reports that come into the child abuse registry are for general neglect, and it covers a wide span of different acts and environments. And while we don't have time to cover them all, I'm going to give you probably the most common forms of abuse that occur. So when we talk about general neglect, the definition of general neglect is any failure on a parent or caretaker's part in providing the basic needs to a child. And those basic needs are the needs for food, clothing, shelter. They also are responsible, that parent and caregiver, to ensure that the child's medical needs are met, that their educational needs are met, and that their need for supervision is met. So if a parent or caretaker fails to provide any of those necessities that we call them for a child's welfare, then that parent or caretaker could be considered creating a neglectful environment. So when we talk a little bit about what types of neglect that are common, one of the first I think that come to mind for most people is a home environment. So home environments where the children are just physically unsafe, meaning that there may be open areas in the roof to where kids are exposed to the environment. Maybe there isn't adequate heating or water. Maybe there is a real bad infestation problem. And the kids are being, maybe they get insect bites, and this is a chronic problem because it's causing them health issues. Maybe they're chronically ill from living in this environment. Maybe it's dirty to the point that it's just unsafe, it's physically unsafe and hazardous for kids to be living in a home. So there's that type of general neglect. There's also general neglect where kids who are really young and not able to fend for themselves or to protect themselves are left at home. And we've heard about this story in the media where kids are left in vehicles unsupervised. And so that would be another form of general neglect. General neglect can also be when a parent fails to get educational needs met or medical care. If medical care is deemed a necessity for the child's life and without it, it would be life-threatening, that could be considered neglectful. Now remember, I am the messenger. I am not creating these laws and definitions on my own. These are really defined at a federal level here in the United States. There are mandates that all states are required to provide an agency to investigate allegations. And then at the state level, each state does have their own laws on how this is regulated and how services are provided. And also, when it comes to the specifics of abuse, states have their own law. So that's how all of this information is really kind of being regulated and monitored and enforced. So when we talk about the signs of general neglect, things that you really want to make sure that you're looking for is the physical presentation of the child is really important. So you may notice things like the child is continually showing up in clothes that are dirty or tattered, or maybe they're too small for the child. Maybe it's the middle of winter and you're always seeing them without a jacket. You might also want to take a look at just their overall hygiene. Do they appear to be like groomed? Does it appear that they're bathing regularly? One of the complaints we often got in regards to kids being left home alone would be about kids not bathing, and then they would come to school and they would have a really strong body odor, and this would be concerning to teachers and other staff at the school. So that's another indicator that you can look for. You also want to look for just the overall development of the child. Does the child appear to be developing normally, or does it seem as if they are underdeveloped? Are they perhaps malnourished? Does it look as if they might be in a deficient state? Are you also engaging with them to where maybe they're approaching you for food, maybe they're coming to school and they're constantly without a lunch? Or maybe they're telling you and disclosing to you that we don't have food at home. All of these are signs and indicators that a child may be in a neglectful environment. You may also notice behavioral indicators, and those are really just the way a child is acting. So if a child is acting withdrawn or scared, they may isolate themselves, they may have trouble socializing with their peers. They may also just be developmentally behind. They may be struggling and having learning disabilities and just some problems with academics at school. You may also notice too that kids who are neglected tend to, sometimes when they do get something, they might hoard it. Kids who go without food will sometimes hoard food and hide food to ensure that they have it for the future. At the same time, you want to make sure that you're not just looking at one sign and leaping to the conclusion that this child is being neglected. This is really about doing an overall assessment and trying to see how many signs are there, because the more signs that you are able to see and identify, the greater likelihood that there is a situation that may need to be reported. So please keep that in account as we go through all the different signs and indicators. We're not just looking for one sign. We are looking to see if there are a number of signs that present together, because in situations where kids are being neglected and abused, you typically see more than one of these indicators. You usually can pick out about 4 or 5 different type of physical and behavioral characteristics that lead you to believe that your suspicions are probably accurate. Okay, so let's move on to the second type of abuse, which is physical abuse. Now, the definition of physical abuse is any non-accidental injury that is inflicted upon a child. Now, when it comes to physical abuse, what we have to keep in mind is that this is different. It varies by region, depending on where you live. Every state has their own definitions of the laws. While there is a federal law that really is the blanket, the definition that I gave you is more from the federal level, that any type of injury, bodily harm that a child has incurred as a result of a non-accidental means can be considered physical abuse. And one of the things we really want to take into account when we're finding ourselves in a situation and there's a child who appears to have some sort of injury is there are certain things that we can look for that help us to determine if this is something that normally occurs with kids or if this was something that was inflicted. And it's a fine line, and we want to make sure that we're just educated and we know the difference between the two. So when we talk about injuries to a child and we talk about it being non-accidental, we know kids get hurt by accidents all day, every day. And those are not the type of injuries that we're talking about. We're really talking about injuries that typically occur when a parent or a caregiver is enforcing some type of discipline, or that parent or caregiver is acting out in anger, or is struggling to control their anger and is lashing out at a child. And as a result, that child receives an injury. The other thing that we need to understand about injuries when it comes to physical abuse is that these aren't all injuries. These are really focused on injuries that are sustained. And typically it's injuries that are sustained over a 24 to 48 hour period of time. Now, mind you, this information may vary state by state, so I'm going to give you information on how to confirm this for the area where you live. But what this means is that if a child gets a red mark, say they are spanked on the thigh with an open hand by their parent and there's redness there, and over the next hour or so that redness fades and it goes away, that does not meet the criteria of definition of what child abuse is. It's an injury that actually is sustained. That means that that injury persists It doesn't just fade away, but you can actually see it for days to come. And that typically takes place in the form of bruises, cuts, scrapes, burns, and we'll talk a little bit more too just about internal injuries, which are the ones that are a little bit harder to see the signs of because sometimes there's no outward presentation. But those are the type of injuries that you're going to want to be looking for. Now, I know it can be really confusing because you're thinking these are kids and they're out there and they're active and they're being physical with one another, and sometimes they're injuring one another. They're getting injured when they're playing sports. And you're right. So we're not talking about any of those kind of injuries. And what we need to understand is that those type of injuries usually occur in pretty much the same locations on the bodies. And those are the ones that are exposed. So you're typically going to see those on the knees and the shins. And if your child is active in sports, they may get injuries on their thighs or playing basketball. When I used to play basketball, I was constantly getting injuries on my arms and my elbows. And so those are really common areas where kids get injuries. What I want you to concentrate on are the areas where it's not typical for a child to have an injury. So if you see some type of bruising or cut or burn or linear marks, and those are just marks that have a definition to them. If you see those on particular areas of the body, it is more likely that those were of non-accidental means. And those areas include the face, the back of the ears, and also on the tips of the ears, the neck, the back, under the arm, and also on the feet and the rib cage. So those are the areas that I want you to pay particular attention to if you see injuries on a child. That should give you a red flag. So keep that in mind. And as I mentioned before, the other thing that you need to take into account is that a child could actually have internal injuries as a result of some type of physical altercation or some type of physical discipline by a parent or caretaker. And you may not see any outward presentation of those injuries. It may not there may not be bruising. A child could have a broken bone and there may not be any signs on the outside. So in that case, it becomes really important to have a dialogue with the child and to ask them questions. And in doing so, and if this is a child that you know and you're close to and you have a trusting relationship with them, it's really important that you just ask very open-ended questions and really let them give you the details and describe what happened, and trying not to paint the picture for them. And if a child is struggling to explain to you how they got the injury, that is another strong indicator, and that is a red flag. When kids get hurt, they know. Usually they can go on and on and on about an injury that they got and describe it in detail. When kids are struggling to tell you about an injury, especially if it's a fresh injury and it looks like it just recently happened and they're telling you, I don't know, then it is a strong likelihood that they really are just afraid of telling you how it really happened. So I want you to also keep that in mind when we talk about the signs of physical abuse. The behavioral signs that you're going to look for are a little bit similar to general neglect. These kids who are victims of physical abuse are often going to struggle in school as well and have problems with learning. They may developmentally be behind. They may also struggle to socialize. You may find that they are aggressive with their peers and they are more likely to bully as a result of the experiences that they're having at home. These kids may also struggle with anxiety and depression as a result of the abuse that they are experiencing. So those are the signs and indicators that you can look for when it comes to children who are victims of physical abuse. Now, as we move on, I want to talk to you about the third type of abuse, and this is sexual abuse. Now, this one makes everybody uncomfortable, and it should, because it should not be happening. But unfortunately, our reality is that children are being sexually abused. And there are some clear signs and indicators that will help us to be able to determine when a child is being victimized. The definition of a sexual abuse is really any type of sexual act, any type of sexual activity that an adult is engaging in with a child or an adolescent And that child and adolescent is of a developmental age where they are not able to comprehend the act nor give consent to the act. And what I want you to understand about that is any child under the age of 17, and this is especially true here in the state of California. You do need to check the laws of the state where you live, because I am fully aware that they vary by state. But children are not considered developmentally able to give consent to sex acts. So if you are talking with a child who is telling you that they engaged in a sex act, but they weren't scared and they weren't fearful, that does not mean that it wasn't abusive. And that can get a little confusing because kids may not know that anything bad happened. And so when they disclose to you, they may not necessarily be thinking that they were victimized. So it's important for us as adults to have that understanding. So when a child is telling us that something's happened, we know the necessary steps that need to be taken. So some types of examples of sexual abuse, it can occur in the form of intercourse, sodomy, masturbation, fondling, and also if the adult is subjecting the child to viewing or making pornography. When it comes to the signs and indicators that you're going to look for, if a child is being sexually abused, you may notice that they have difficulty moving, walking, running, sitting. Maybe it's painful to them. Maybe they're experiencing some discomfort and they tell you about it. Maybe they are also complaining of burning or itchiness or a rash in the genital area. If you are the parent and caretaker and you are helping your child during bath time and you're concerned that they might have been a victim of sexual abuse, bath time is usually a great time to be able to observe their body. Also, too, when they're taking off their clothes and they're disrobing, or if they took off their clothes on their own and put it in a hamper or put it somewhere, or they hid them, it is really important to check their clothing. And you can check it for fluids in their underwear. You can check it for spotting, blood spots. You can also see if they are experiencing wetting their pants or defecating in their pants, because those are also indicators of sexual abuse. And it's really important to, if you notice these things, to have a dialogue with your child or to talk to the particular child that you are caring for and just ask them what happened. And not be, you don't have to lead them and you don't have to tell them what you think is happening. You really just want for them to share with you. And if they tell you that, yeah, I'm experiencing some pain down there and it hurts, I really do encourage that you have them go in for a medical check, because what medical examinations can do for us is give us further evidence to support our suspicions. And so what they might find on a medical examination might be irritation or rash. It's also a sign if a child is having STDs, is diagnosed with an STD, or is experiencing chronic urinary tract infections, or just chronic infections, yeast infections. And also, too, it's really important that this information get documented and that you express your concerns with the doctor. So when it comes to sexual abuse, again, I can't stress this enough, we're not just looking for one sign. We're really looking for a combination of the physical signs, some type of physical evidence, as well as also some type of behavioral sign that leads us to believe there's some strong suspicion that this child might be sexually abused. Now, the fourth type of abuse that I want to talk to you about is emotional abuse. Now, emotional abuse is probably the least reported form of child abuse. It is so because it can be difficult to determine when it's happening. The signs and symptoms aren't always clear because they could be masked as something else. And oftentimes what ends up happening is they get masked as a behavioral problem or a mental health problem. So what we want to do is we want to just try to be as educated and informed as possible so that we can hopefully separate out the two. Now, emotional abuse is defined by the intentional infliction of emotional distress or mental suffering upon a child. And this is done by a parent or a caregiver. And usually it's with a goal to diminish the child, humiliate them, punish them, make them feel bad about themselves. And as I mentioned before, most often it's as a result of a parent acting out their own pain. And unfortunately, they're acting it out onto their children. And so there's a sense of relief that can come when you're making someone else suffer. And while it is horrific, and it's not anything that I think any parent would decide to have kids and think like, this is how I'm going to raise my kids. It is unfortunate because it happens, and that's because adults and parents are struggling with their own pain and their own trauma and have not gotten help. And so unfortunately, then it really kind of gets projected on and passed on to their children. And so you'll find that kids in this environment, kids who are being emotionally abused, will act out and they will have behavioral problems. And they'll also really struggle with some symptoms of whether it's depression, anxiety, different forms of anxiety where it may be attachment issues that they have. They may develop OCD over time. They may also just be fearful of authority or adults in general. They may withdraw and isolate. They may be closed off, not share or express any emotions. They've learned to just shut down. They may self-harm and they may start to harm themselves. These type of kids often struggle with self-worth issues. They don't really know their value. So they may engage in delinquent behaviors to really act out their pain. They may turn to using street drugs or prescription drugs. They may also seek out comfort in the form of sexual activities with other peers. So those are all the things that you need to keep in mind when it comes to emotional abuse and the signs and indicators to look for. So we really kind of covered all the different types of abuse and the signs and indicators that you need to be on the lookout for. Now, if you find yourself in this situation where you've heard this information and you're thinking, wow, I feel even more so that something's going on here, and I'm recognizing that there are some signs, and now I'm just not even sure what to do with that information. I really encourage you to watch, to continue to listen, and to watch the other videos as we move on to the other two sections, because they will help you. And you always have the option of going to nourishedminds.com. This is an online resource that I've created for you, so you can go and get help in the form of guides and books, and you can watch videos there to give you that additional support and guidance you need through this really challenging time. And I have a specific guide on this very topic, and it is entitled, If You Suspect Abuse. And I not only cover the topics that we're talking about today, but I get really in detail and walk you through step by step on how to manage the situation. And I have a whole chapter on just how to talk to kids when they're telling you about an abusive situation. Whether you are in the profession of working with kids, if you're a teacher or you're a doctor, or maybe you're a school volunteer or you're a mom in a soccer team, it's a guide to help you have that conversation so that you can then help that child. So be sure to go to nourishedminds.com/guides and you can check out the guide there. Go ahead and download it, and it's If You Suspect Abuse.